Okay, and we are recording to the cloud. Good morning, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming back to Tzurba B'Rabbanan, and thank you those who are here in person for braving this inclement weather. And for those of you watching from the comfort of your home, we won't hold it against you. Okay, let's pick up. We started last week the Melacha of Borer, the Melacha of sorting. We'll be dealing with this now for a number of shiurim. Very, very practical, very, very relevant halacha. We did mention, I'll just start off with a machshavik piece. I won't read again. On page 313, we have the piece from Peninei Halacha talking about the idea behind Borer. This is one of those things that people very often ask, why does God really care? If I take the bone from the chicken or the chicken from the bone or whatever. The answer is he does. We saw a little bit of an idea here behind what Borer represents, maybe on a level between sorting between the good and the bad in the world. Just want to read you a short piece. This is from, you don't have this in front of you, it's from Rabbi Rimon's Sefer on Shabbat. Rabbi Rimon has, to date, published 4 volumes on Shabbat. I think he's planning on publishing about 12 volumes or something like that. But he goes through, and this is an idea, he says, also similar, related to Borer. He says like this, there's a great, deep philosophical idea behind this. He quotes the Ramchal, who writes in Derech Hashem and in Dat Tvunot and in a number of places, who deals with the question of Madua Kadosh Baruch Hu Barat Haolam. Nothing too complicated. Why did God create the world? And he says, Masbir Shakadosh Baruch Hu Shekulo Tov Otzar La'ativ. This is the Ramchal's Shita. He says God is all good, and He wants to share of that goodness. L'shem Kach Bara Olam Shesh Bo Tzilim Nivaim Shelahem Yachol La'ativ. And therefore He created a world filled with creatures to whom He can benefit. So then the question is asked again, a very simple question, right? Why is there evil in the world? Why couldn't everything just be good and immediate, and we could immediately receive the good without having to work hard, without having to perform mitzvot, etc.? And the Ramchal explains, if we were to receive all the good immediately without working for it, again, this is not in your books, I'm reading from Rabbi Rimon's Sefer. That would not be the true good. Ultimately, the greatest good, the greatest benefit that we can receive comes from having dealt with and struggled and achieving it ourselves. Person has to work hard, person has to be able to select the good from the bad. If everything was just good, that would be a free gift, what the Zohar calls the bread of shame, right? That is not the ultimate good, but that is somewhat causes shame and embarrassment. And therefore he says, we can understand a little bit of the depth behind this melacha of breira, of sorting the good from the bad. It appears like something very small, something very insignificant, as we said, right? The chicken off the bone, or the bone of the chicken, or the fish, or whatever it is. You separate the seed from the shell, between the bits of dirt and the wheat. Aside from being a detail in preparing food, there is an idea behind this idea of sorting and selecting and sifting, right, the good from the bad. So I'm sure you think about that every time you sit at your Shabbos table and you separate the meat from the bone, etc. But that's just a little bit, as we get into the very, very technical details, but to have in our mind, something, the depth behind these ideas. Okay, so let's open up. We're on volume 18. We are Bezrat Hashem going to finish volume 18 today. I'll have to bring you the books next week for volume 19. By the way, if anybody wants to purchase these books, once we finish with them, you are able to do so. They currently belong to the shul, but you can purchase the books. If you're interested in sponsoring the future volumes, there's also opportunities for that. Just let me know. Okay, we're on page 305. We started last week, we saw that when it comes to Borer, the Gemara is somewhat cryptic. But we saw that sorting is the melacha, but when it is done in a way, essentially when it's done what we call derech achila, it's performed in a way that you are not sorting as such, but you are eating and you're taking the food that you want to eat, that would be permitted. It would be permitted when I fulfill 3 conditions. And I have to fulfill all 3 conditions, right? If any one of these conditions is lacking, then it becomes forbidden. What are the three conditions? So we said one has to remove ochel mitoch psolet. One has to be taking the good from the bad, the food from the waste. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a few moments. We said it has to be miyad, le'altar. It has to be for immediate use. We discussed last week at length what does immediate use mean. Doesn't necessarily mean right now. We said it's immediate around Jewish time, meaning there were all the discussions. I won't repeat what we said, but generally speaking, if it's for the upcoming meal, or it's part of the meal, even if it is a few hours in the future, that would still be considered immediate, right? We saw that last week, and you have the notes here. And thirdly, we said it has to be done by yad velo bekli. We discussed at length as well, when it's done with my hand and it's not done with a utensil, not done with a designated utensil for sorting. So we discussed if you have a sieve or a strainer or something like that, which is designed in order to, that would be forbidden. What about if I use my cutlery, if I'm using my fork or my spoon or something like that? So we saw a bit of difference of opinion, but generally speaking, we say like this: if you're using the cutlery, not for the purposes of sorting, but you're using the cutlery because that's how you eat, because you don't want to get your hands dirty, because you're in a polite company, etc. So therefore, the cutlery is considered more or less as an extension of one's hand, and that is not considered a kli, that is considered a yad, and therefore that would be permitted. One thing which actually we skipped last week, go back to page 303 for a moment. The question comes 302. The question comes up with a salt shaker. You know, sometimes people put grains of rice in the salt shaker in order to keep it dry, in order that it should flow, etc. So the question is asked: is that therefore considered sorting? Right? When I pour out of the salt shaker, which holds, it's a specialized utensil, I'm pouring the salt from the rice. Is that considered separation or not? So you'll see here in source number 22. Actually, before this, right? This is in a footnote from the Shemrat Shabbat Kilchatan. So the box above tells us that in the following footnote, the Shemrat Shabbat writes in the name of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Okay, you see this is in the paragraph just above source 22, that if one puts rice in a salt shaker to absorb moisture, it's preferable not to pour salt from it on Shabbat through holes to prevent the rice from getting through, as this may be considered sorting using a utensil. Okay, that's an interesting shita. But then he quotes a different reason for leniency here in source number 22. He writes, Shamati Magon of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, the kli amiyuchad livol letzorach miyadi bilvad, efshar deino bichlal aisur livol bakli. Okay, so here he writes a different leniency, very interesting. He says, if you have a kli, so it's a utensil which is designed for sorting, but it's sorting for immediate use, meaning you're going to sort it, and I'm going to use it right now. He says that may be permitted. So, for example, he says, he relates this to tea. Okay, but if you skip a few lines, he says, in the same way that if I'm using my hand, right, that's not considered sorting because it's for immediate use, for immediate consumption. That's derech achila. So therefore, hu adin according to that, you could use a salt shaker which has got grains of rice in it, based on this reasoning. He then says, quotes the Chayei Adam, last line on page 302, says, "Olam b'chayei Adam choshesh gam b'chayei gavna v'kadav tefshad gam chayav v'chein bo l'achronim v'tzarech iyun." Okay, so not everybody accepts that specific leniency. It's somewhat of a chiddush. However, look at the next source, number 23, Rav Ovadia Yosef. He says regarding the salt shaker, one does not have to be concerned at all. He says, "Kli hanikra milchiyah she'elvu galgilei oles im hamelach shebetocha kedei limnoa lachot b'melach." Right, you're putting the rice in order to absorb the moisture. Ha'im mutar l'shtamesh ba b'shabbat lefazer mimena melach or ma'achal al yadei ha'mechseh ha'menukav v'yeshav milchiyah or havei kabolela. Is this considered sorting or not? Nir'eh la'aniyut da'ati lehatir. Rav Ovadia tzmutar. You're not sorting, your intention is not to sort the salt from the rice. It's just you want to pour the salt. It happens to be that there's rice there, but it was never really considered mixed up together. It's not considered sorting. He says that would be permitted. Okay, we then saw there was a discussion here about a slotted spoon. By the way, it's also interesting. I'll just mention that Rav Ovadia also has a leniency here. He says, what if I have soup? We mentioned soup, right? The brera always comes up by the soup because the one kid only likes the carrots and the other kid won't eat the onions and then the whole thing. And you right. So if you want, what if you have solid bits, right? You have your carrots or your tomatoes or your chicken or whatever it is in the soup, and you just want the solid, you don't want any of the soup. Could you use a slotted spoon, a slotted ladle in order to remove the solid from the liquid? Okay. So again, so if we think about it, you're taking the solid, which is what you want to eat now, which would be ochel mitoch solid. We'll get to in a few moments. You want to eat it now. The question is this considered a kli for the sake of separating and sorting? So there are those who say no, who say you can't. If you turn over the page, you'll see 304. You have the tshuva of this is in the Or Letzion, but Rav Avadia I think says similarly. He says yesh latir l'otzi ochel l'dei matzeket zo af shamalak mistanen derech acholim. So he allows it. He says you could use it. Im da'ato le'achol ochel ze. If you plan on eating this food immediately. Nonetheless, not so straightforward. There are those who are stringent, and it's okay to be stringent in this. And he explains why. He says. So you take the soup with the ladle and the soup or the water goes through the holes. That's like you're taking the food, and that's allowed. Even though we'd say you shouldn't do it with a kli, etc., etc., etc. Mikol makom, about halfway through the hara, he says Mikol makom yesh letzaref et shitat hasovrim de'em brera balach. Okay, there are opinions that when it comes to liquid, there's no sorting. He says we can add that opinion as well. He says this spoon or this ladle is not a specific sorting utensil, but it's a serving utensil. Okay, just wanted to show you, if you just go to the back, there was a tshuva from Shut B'Mara Bazak. So the last page of the book, page 324. Yeah, there's a similar question which was asked: Ha'im mutar lotzi yirakot o kneidlach mimarak b'Shabbat toch kadei shimush b'kaf im cholim? Can you use again the slotted spoon to take out the solids from the soup, from the liquid? And they ask if there's a difference between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. So they in this tshuva from Eretz Chaim, they actually say the whole thing is allowed. It says mutar bein haposkim k'mechaber bein haposkim k'rama lotzi yirakot u'mutzakim acherim mitoch marak gam b'kaf im cholim. So you're allowed to take the solid from the liquid, and they give three reasons why. It says Aleph avara shel yavesh mitoch lash matzav shel chelek ma'poskim eno nachshav k'bera klal. Okay, not everyone agrees, but again, it's one factor that there are those who say when you're taking solid from liquid, that is not considered borer. Also, it could be that you're dealing with a large solid item, so it's not considered a mixture. And Gimel, it says kan eno makpid sheisharu hanozlim ela rotze rak la'avir ota chaticha letzalachat. Meaning, you almost similar to the case with the salt, but essentially you want to take the big bit. You don't want to separate it. If some of the liquid comes, you won't mind. The opposite case, by the way, is far more problematic, which is if I'm serving up soup, okay, but again, I know that this kid doesn't like the onion, so I put the ladle in the soup and I have a ladle full of soup, but there's a piece of onion inside. Can I then remove the onion? No, I can't. That would be brera, because that's essentially, that's what I don't want to eat. And that I can't take out, but this is the opposite case. Okay.
This question to come up. That's really
okay, so that's exactly what we're going to talk about now. It's exactly the topic we're coming to. We've discussed until now ochel mitoch psolet. So the classic case is I have the food and I have the shells. So clearly, I have the nuts and the shells or whatever. So the nuts are ochel, it's what I want to eat. The shells are psolet. I have the chicken and I have the bone, which I can't eat. The chicken itself is the ochel, and the bone is going to be the psolet. What if I have, as you say, two types of food, right? Shnei minei ochalim. I have peanuts and raisins in a bowl, and I only want to eat the peanuts, or I only want to eat the raisins, right? Take your pick, whichever. I'm sure we can divide the room into the people who eat peanuts and people who eat the raisins. Why they put them together, I don't know, because everybody only wants one. But that's the case. So do we consider now two types of food? How do we look at it? We could say, when we said ochel mitoch psolet, I mean, there's food and there's waste, so I have to separate the food and not the waste. But if it's two types of food, take whatever I want. I set aside whatever I want. That's one way of looking at it. Or I could say no. I could say if I want one type of food, but I don't want the other type of food, so the type that I want is considered ochel. The type that I don't want is considered psolet. Then I could ask a further question. I could say, is this something which is objective, or is this something which becomes subjective? Could it change? If there's something which most people wouldn't eat, Again, ask the question, why is it then together? I don't know, but maybe that's the way you cook it or whatever. But I'm different to everybody else, right? Do we go by a subjective or objective view? Okay. So let's see, page 305. We talked solid and sorting two types of food. So this is the Gemara that we saw already. We'll just refresh our memory. Source number 26. Setan Rabbanan, Hayulaf Anav Minay Ochalim. When I have in front of me different types of food. Okay, great. All right, I can set aside and eat, I can set aside and leave it, but I shouldn't set aside, and if I do, I'm chayav chatat. Okay, we saw last time how the Gemara explains the different cases and the three conditions we saw, how it's qualifying. Now note again, the Gemara here talks about ayulafanav minay ochalin. So let's see regarding our question. First source we have is Tosfot. Tosfot in source number 27, the bottom of the page. Tosfot Yaakov Rabbeinu Chananah as follows. Okay, the Gemara said minay ochalin. It said types of food, and therefore, if I have one type of food from another type of food, the melacha of borer applies. What is brera? What is sorting? I'm sorting the type of food that I don't want away from the type that I want. Okay, that's the key line. That which I don't want to eat right now, and it might be that it's a food that I like. So even subjectively for me, generally speaking, it's not considered psolet. But right now, that's the question. Right now, I want to eat food A. I don't want to eat food B. Therefore, I can't separate food B because that is psolet. For me right now, that's considered psolet mitoch ochel. V'chein mashma b'Yerushalmi. Okay, he says that is the implication of the Yerushalmi as well. That is how Rabbeinu Chananah, that is how Tosfot learn. Now the Rambam, it's not completely clear, but many understand the Rambam in the following way. Have a look at the next page, source 28. So this is the Rambam in Ochot Shabbat. He says, I have two types of food that are mixed in together. You separate one from the other, and you leave it to eat now. Right, you have to do it straight away. What does the Rambam not say? He doesn't say which one you separate. He doesn't say you separate the one that you want versus the one you don't. He says, bolel echad me'echad. So echad me'echad, that would mean, now, if I want to sort them, I don't have this rule of ochel mitoch psolet. I have two types of food. I separate one from, there's still breira. You're right, the Gemara said. It has to be done immediately. It has to be done with the hand. But if I'm dealing with two types of food, and it's not the same as if I'm dealing with food and waste, and therefore I could just separate one from the other. That's what seems to be the implication. Let's read the Shulchan Aruch now without the Ramah. The Ramah is there in brackets. We'll come back to the Ramah afterwards. But the Shulchan Aruch says, and he quotes the Rambam, exact direct verbatim quote from the Rambam. So the implication is, and it may be, okay, we'll get to the practical halacha in a moment. But at this stage, it seems to be, according to the Rambam and according to the Shulchan Aruch, that if I have two types of food, again, I'm only interested in one. That's why I'm separating them. I'm only interested in one right now and not the other. But I can separate whichever one I want. Whichever one I want. The whole din of ochel mitoch psolet does not apply when there's two types of food. However, the Ashkenazim always make things difficult. Okay, the Ramah comes along and let's read the Shulchan Aruch now with the two words in the middle that the Ramah adds in. He says, "Ayula panav shnei minei ochalim oavim, borel echad me'echad umeniach hasheni kedei lechol miyad." In other words, I separate one of them and I leave the other one behind in order to eat now. In other words, the Ramah in those two words is adding on. In the way he does this, sometimes when you learn the Shulchan Aruch, so sometimes the Ramah will. At the end, the Shulchan Aruch will write a din. He'll say, this is asur or this is mutar or whatever it is, and the Ramah will say, okay, that's not our practice. We do differently. Or yesh chokin or whatever. Or Shulchan Aruch says mutar, and the Ramah says yesh machmirin. Or the Shulchan Aruch says it's mutar, it says asur, and the Ramah says yesh makin. Okay, sometimes what he does, he'll just add his words in to the language of the Shulchan Aruch, and it's not necessarily clear. Maybe the Ramah understands that the Shulchan Aruch also paskin that way. Or maybe he is arguing with him, but he wants to emphasize it. Okay. But those two words completely change the meaning. That means that if I have two types of food, it's exactly like we said before, like Tosfot, like Rabbeinu Chananah, that two types of food I treat exactly the same as I would ochel mitoch psolet. Okay, what's behind the machloket? What's the difference here between these two ways of looking at it? So it might be, and the Biur Halacha writes this in the continuation, but you don't have it in your books. So I'm going to read it to you from, again, this is from Rav Rimon Sefer. The Biur Halacha brings the Yeshuot Yaakov, and he explains that they might be arguing here fundamentally on what Melechet Borer is all about. What is the Melacha? What is the behind? So he says like this. This is the Biur Halacha. It says, "Melacha inani kreit al breirat psolet, rak de mitaken ha'ochel sheyeh ra'oi la'achila." Remember, every single one of the 39 melachot is a constructive action. Okay, there are some melachot that it's very, very difficult to understand this. Most obvious question is destroy, right? There is a of building, of boneh, and there's a malacha of soter, which is the opposite of building, which is deconstruction. How is soter a constructive act? The answer is the malacha of soter is soter al menat livnot, right? When you are destroying something in order to build it back bigger and better, or whatever it is. Okay, and we have, for example, there's a malacha of writing, there's a malacha of erasing, but it's only erasing in order to write. There's a malacha of tearing. Again, it's correct al menat litvor. All of these examples. By the way, before you get excited and think that you can do anything on Shabbos, midrabanan, it's still, even if it's not a constructive now, even if it's destructive, it's still going to be forbidden. So we have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But again, so he says with borer, what the melacha of borer, we're not interested in the fact that specifically that you're separating the waste, but we're interested in the fact that you are creating a tikkun, that you are fixing the food. You're making the food edible. If I have a mixture of food and waste, I cannot eat it. When I separate the waste, what I'm really doing is I'm correcting the food. Okay? And that is the melacha. V'zeu ha-melacha hatzricha leguf ha-ochel, שעושה אותו אוכל גמור. ולפי זה דווקא פסולת מתוך אוכל, דאינו אוי לאכילה כלל, מתחילה, ועושה אותו אוכל על ידי הברירה הזאת. In other words, where do I say that there is a tikkun of the food? Essentially, what he's saying is breira is similar to the melacha of mevasha, right? Conceptually, you're taking something which is in an inedible state and you're turning it into an edible state. So if I have food together with waste, it's in an inedible state. I take away the waste, I've now got food, and that is what I'm doing. That is the tikkun ha'ochel. If I have two types of food, okay, it's edible. I prefer to have it this way. Right, but I'm not actually creating that tikkun ha'ochel. So that would be the side of the argument to say that if breira is all about the tikkun ha'ochel, about correcting the food, fixing the food, it's like cooking conceptually. So then, if I have two types of food, that's what the Yeshuot Yaakov says. And then he continues the aval b'shnei minei ochalin. Right, when I have two types of food, כשמפריד האוכל בשנים מחמת שאינו רוצה לאוכלו. You could compare it to a melacha שאינה צריכה לגופה. He says, כיוון דאוכל זה שרוצה לאכול כעת, או אוי לאכילה, אפילו לא נפרד האוכל השני. At the end of the day, the food is still edible, even if I haven't separated it. רק מחמת שכעת אין אפשר חשקב. Okay, so that is what, that is one side. We would say it's the tikkun ha'ochel. Versus Tosfot, who would say, no, the melacha of breira, we have a melacha about cooking. It's called cooking. The melacha of borer is relating to the hotza'at psol, to the act of taking away the waste. That is the melacha. That is the sort. That's what I'm doing. And therefore, the Biur Halacha, by the way, himself, he argues with the Yeshuot Yaakov. So at the end of the day, even if you accept that it's about tikkun ha'ochel, you could still say, okay, but the food in its current state is in a way that I don't want to eat it. So therefore, it's still a correction. Okay, those are two ways of looking at it. That's maybe gives us an understanding what's behind this machloket. But bottom line is, so what we've seen to this point is the following. When I have two types of food, do I consider that, and I want one of them, but I don't want the other, do I consider that the food that I don't want right now is considered psolet, and therefore I'm only allowed to select the food that I want? That is how Tosfot understands. That's based on Rabbeinu Hananel, based on the Yerushalmi. Or do I say, no, ochel mitoch psolet applies when one of them is objectively psolet. But if it's two types of food, I can take whichever one I want. That is the Rambam, and that seems to be the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah says, no, we have to be machna. Okay, so how do we paskin? What do the Achronim say? Let's see the Biur Halacha in source number 30. He says as follows. מניח השני וכו'. הנה, לשון המחבר מועתק מהרמב"ם פרק ח' מהלכות שבת הלכה י"ג, והם כפשטן מניח לאחרים או לעצמו. The Shulchan Aruch copies the Rambam verbatim. והרב, you always have to know, whenever I posek or whenever anybody talks and says harav, right? So who are you talking about? If I ask you, if I say harav, you tell me you're talking about Rav Soloveitchik. If I say harav, you say I'm talking about Rav Kook. Okay, but when the Biur Halacha writes harav, he's talking about the Ramah. Okay, for obvious reasons, he wasn't talking about Rav Soloveitchik or Rav Kook. So here he's referring to the Ramah. He says Mosif Tevat Hasheni Kedai. He adds in those two letters, those two words, V'shina kavanat ha'machaber v'Rambam zal, and he changes completely the meaning. Le'odia lanu deoto she'eno רוצה אתה הוא כפסולת וצריך לבוא אותו שרוצה לאכול דווקא. He's emphasizing to you the fact that which you don't want right now, that is considered psolet, and I have to separate only the food which I want. Just as the Trumat HaDeshen writes. Okay. Now, in that Rambam Mugamkin Karam. So we know certainly what the Ramah says. Question is, as I said, he doesn't write it in the language of Yesh Cholkin. He doesn't write it explicitly that this is a different opinion. So isn't this actually the same opinion of the Rambam? Again, the Rambam didn't spell it out. You could interpret it that way. In that Rambam Mugamkin Karama Lo, he says it's not clear. Yesh Gdolim Sheinem Sovrim. Okay. So you see, there are those who don't learn the Rambam that way. Ayen בספר מאמר מרדכי שהביא בשם הרב רבינו דוד הרמב"ם בפירושו לרמב"ם שכתבתי בשני מיני אוכלים אף על פי שלא אכל מה שבירר. Okay, so this is one way of understanding the Rambam, as we said previously. If you have two types of food and you separate the one which you don't want to eat, אלא מה שהיה בורא בידו אין יכול לבוא ביום, או למחרת ואחר המין שנשאר שלי, that is permitted. זה לא אסרינן זה אלא בבוא פסולת גמור מתוך אוכל מה שאין כן אחר. That's only when you're separating complete waste, objective waste, not yet. דבר שני מיני אוכלים. וכל שבורא כדי לאכול האתר, שלי עד כאן לשון המאמר מרדכי. Okay, so there are those who learn the Rambam the way that we in Sumam Rabbanan have learned the Rambam. So then, at the top of page 307, continues the Biur Halacha. He says, "Omnam למעשה אין לזוז מדברי תרומת הדשן לרמה שמקורנו מדברי הלכה." Okay, we didn't see the Rosh inside, but he's one of the Rishonim. He says, no, two types of food is considered Ocham Psolet. So that's the conclusion of the Biur Halacha. We need to be stringent, even when it's two types of food, we need to view it as food and waste, right? In that fashion. That is for Ashkenazim, certainly. And what about Sfardim? We follow the Shulchan Aruch. So you'll see in the box over here, the Kaf HaChaim and Rav Ovadia, again, who knows how to be lenient when necessary. Both of them are machmir and say that we should follow the Ramah. So it's Sfardim as well should follow the Ramah for this. But have a look, source number 31. This is from Shut called Shema Shlomo. This is the Shut of Rav Shlomo Amar, Rishon LeZion, the former chief rabbi of Israel and chief rabbi of the Yerushalayim. So he says like this. He says, Yesh la'ir b'divrei Kaf HaChaim. Again, Kaf HaChaim says that Sfardim who follow the Shulchan Aruch should also be stringent like the Ramah in this case. He says, Yesh la'ir, shekatav pashtot she'amin she'no rotze le'echol atah chashuv kipsolet v'asol le'varo. He says that the food that you don't want now is also considered waste and you can't remove it. V'lo izkir b'zeh shum cholek. He doesn't say that anybody argues. U'lefi ha'amor hinai kol ani ravan kadish ha'svir alu dedat ha'ramam eno ken. But we've, obviously earlier in the Tshuva, shown that many hold that the Rambam does argue. ואין האוכל השני נחשב לפסולת, and it's not considered that way. ועל כן יכול לבוא גם אותו מין שאינו רוצה לאכול לאלתר. Okay, second paragraph. ויותר יש להעיר בדברי גאון עולם מרן הראשון לציון בכל סיני, הלכות בורר. Okay, now he says the same thing regarding, this is what Rav Ovadia says. He quotes, אם בירר המין השני שאינו חפץ בו כעת חייו, עד כאן לשונו, ולפיה, and now he says, לפי האמור, דעת הרמב"ם ומרן ז"ל להתיר בזה, ולא אבל לפסוק בסכינה חריפה דחייו. Okay, he says he shouldn't have said with such a sharp knife. He shouldn't have been so clear cut that one's going to be chayav for this. At the end of the day, he also says, you see the last paragraph, he says one should be stringent. Okay, so bottom line in terms of that, our question was as follows. We saw in the Gemara that if you have food and waste, and you want to separate the food, you have to separate the food, and not the other way around. We asked the question, if you have two types of food, one which I want now, one which I don't want now. Do I view the type that I don't currently want as psolet? So according to Tosfot, and according to the Rosh, and according to the Ramah, right, and that whole school of thought, yes, it's viewed as psolet, and you have to separate the ochel specifically. According to the Rambam, we saw there is a way one could learn the Rambam to say that no, two types of food, I can separate whichever one I want. The Shulchan Aruch seems to imply that way as well. However, even most of the Sfardi poskim say that it's good to be, at the very least, good to be machmir like the Rambam. Okay, so Lamaise, that's what we will do. We'll view it as ochel and psolet. However, we recognize there is a significant opinion that says that is not the case, and if we have other cases of doubt and other shleikot to add in, that would be, we would bear that into consideration as well. Okay, the next question.
So if I have two pieces of food,
Yes.
I only want one, this guy sitting next to me wants the other one, I give it to the other person, or does he have to take it?
Yeah. What are you talking about? It's the same type of food, or?
Depending on what I have a carrot in my soup, I don't want the carrot, the guy sitting next to me wants the carrot, can I give it to him, or does he have to take it?
So okay, so you're asking if somebody wants to eat it, but the person who wants to eat it right now is not me.
Right.
So again, I'm taking it out. I'm taking it out in order. Right, I'm taking it out to give it to him to eat. So it's considered awful. Okay. The next question that we have to discuss is ochel and ochel. What is considered two types of food? What is considered one type of food? Okay, some interesting discussions that come up. Yeah, just mentioned we're coming up. It's nearly Chodesh Adar. We've got Purim coming up soon. We've got Tu B'Shvat this week, but then it's 30 days until Purim. So we talk about two types of food. So we start thinking about Purim. We start thinking about Mishloach Manot. I just have to mention this because every year it comes up, and every year that we all know that Mishloach Manot, you have to send two types of food, right? So what is defined as two types of food? So many people, I think this is an English thing. I don't know if other places think it as well, but many people have this idea in their head that you have to send two types of food with two separate brachot. Right? You've heard this? Every year I get asked this question. Do the two types of food for the Mishloach? Most people send 17 types of food, okay? But do the two types of food that are in the Mishloach Manot have to be separate brachot? It's just absolutely not. There's no source for that. That is not the halacha. You need two types of food. The Gemara says you could send two types of meat, right? Which are certainly the same bracha. It just has to be different things. That it's not one type. Where does this idea come from of two brachot? I think where it comes from is the fact that if it's two different brachot, so it's certainly two types of food. So therefore, no one's going to get confused. But there is no source. It does not have to be. You can have two types of food that have the same bracha, and that is you still fulfilled the mitzvah of Mishloach Manot. Okay. What about Boreh? Right? If you have your Mishloach Manot, and it's Purim Mishalash, right? So we've got Shabbos in the middle. And how does it? So how does it work? If I have two different types of food or two types of the same food, so there's an interesting Shuvai on the Trumat Deshen. Trumat Deshen is one of the Rishonim, one of the most significant Ashkenazi Rishonim. There's barely a siman in Shulchan Aruch where the Ramah does not quote the Trumat Deshen. What's very interesting about the Sefer Sheilot v'Tshuvot Trumat Deshen is who asked the questions. He did. Right, this is a technique that's generally accepted. That the Trumat Deshen, I'm sure that people asked him questions as well. But when he wrote his sefer, he wrote it in the format of a shut of a responsa. Sometimes you're reading through, you have a responsa literature, and there's a question. Where does that question come from, and why did that ever happen, and why did somebody ask that? So the Trumat Deshen made up his own questions in order to, these were the halachot that he wanted to teach. So sometimes you say, that question is not significant, whatever. All the questions here are significant because he chose them and he wrote them himself. Actually, no, this is a contemporary practice. Some of these columns of Ask the Rabbi, etc. So there's an author of one of those columns who once said to me that a number of the questions he actually composes himself. So anyway, I won't tell you who it is. So the Trumat Deshen in number 32 he writes the following question: Chatichot dagim. So you have different pieces of fish that are left on a board, right? Or bekala, or in a bowl. So you have the different pieces of fish, different pieces of herring, probably. Not sure what are the fish they had then, but that are separate from one another. So there's some of the pieces of fish I want to eat, and some of the pieces of fish I don't want to. Hey, right, eat some of them at the Kiddush, now I need some of them for Surah Shlishit. Heach yivlo elu me'elu shelo yavo lidei chiyuv bulim. How do I separate the pieces of fish in order not to come to the chiyuv of borer? So he writes, he says to the school, where did you come to this question from? You don't have to be so concerned. That is not considered borer. Okay, we spoke about food and waste, and then we spoke about two types of food. Now we're talking about two pieces of the same food. Says the Trumat Hadesh, and that's not considered borer, right? Two types of pieces of the same food. You're dealing with one type. The Tana said, "Are you minei ochalim?" That was the language in the Gemara. All the Sfarim say two types of food. Mikol makom, shnei minei dagim, lav min echad mikra. So if it's two different types of fish, okay, if you have herring and matias, so that's a different story. But if it's all, you have a plate with different pieces and all the same type of fish, that's not two separate types. That's called one type. Okay, there's no sorting over there. So it says the Rama over here in source number 33. He says, Shnei minei dagim, miklei shnei minei ochalin. If I have two different types of fish, that is considered two different types of food. Okay, and therefore you could give them maybe as mishloach manot as well. That's a separate question. Two different types of fish. So again, I have to take one from the other with my hand. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Again, if the Rama has to tell me that they're considered different types, it's because there's somebody who says they're the same type, right? And he says, you would have thought that when I have borer, when I have a mixture, they're not mixed, right? They're all on the plate, but nonetheless, they're different. It's considered different types. But then he says, wherever it's all the same type, you might say, if it's all right, I don't have herring and matias, I just have herring, and it's all the same type, but there's some big pieces and some small pieces. He says there, nonetheless, that's the opinion of the Rama. He says that's not considered sorting. And again, he says that's not considered sorting because there's somebody who thinks that it is considered sorting, and that is the Taz. Have a look over the page in source number 34, the Taz of Torei Zahav. He says, "Tamu alei ani דלפי הנראה לרבות הענקת שני מינים, דבאחד פשיטה ששייך ברע במה שרוצה להניח, אלא אפילו שני מינים זה כבר ניכר ומופרש כל אחד מחברו, ואין שייך בזה עירוב, אפילו אחי לא יברור." Okay, even though he said when there's two distinct types, even though they're not mixed together, nonetheless we can't separate one from the other. ותו דבאוכל המעורב עם פסולת now he says like this. He has the chiddush of the Taz. He says if you have food together with waste, it's all one type, right? But you have to separate the food from the waste, not the other way around. But even if he says even if there is no psolet, it's all food. It's all the same food. But there's some that I want to eat now, and there's some that I want to keep for later. That which I don't want now is called psolet, and I can't separate it. In other words, says the Taz, just like we saw there was an argument between Ocha and Psolet versus two different types of food, you're telling me that they're both food, but actually one of them I'm calling Psolet. So what's the difference? So it's two types of food, meaning one I want to eat now and one I want to eat later. So why does there have to be two different types, even if it's the same? Now he says here in the next paragraph in bold, he says, says, I disagree with the Rama. You have one type of food, and some pieces are a bit bigger, and some pieces are a bit smaller. I specifically want the bigger pieces, right? Obviously, and not the smaller pieces. So he says, either you have to do it. You have to take specifically the one you want, right? Or I just take a piece, and whichever piece comes up in my hand, that's the one that I'll eat. In other words, I'm not specifically sorting. So that's the Tazia, very, very stringent opinion. He disagrees with the Rama, disagrees with Trumat Hadesh. Even if it's one type of food, then still borer applies because it's what I want now versus what I don't want now. However, the Mishnah Berurah here in source number 35 says that we don't have to be that stringent. Most Achronim agree with the Rama. So now Taz machmir afilu b'min echad. The Taz is the one who's stringent, even with just one type of food. שלא יבוא אלא אותו שרוצה לאכול אתה, או שיקח סתם מן הבא בידו. It says either if I want to be specific, I want to be picky, I have to pick the one that I want, or I have to be not picky at all and just take whatever comes to my hand. אבל הרבה האחרונים חלקו עליו, and many disagree with the Taz, והסכימו עם מה שפסק כתרומת הדשן. Okay, so that's bottom line. He says if it's all one type of food, if it's all the same thing, even if it's all one plate of schnitzels, yeah, some of the schnitzels are a bit bigger, some are a bit smaller, whatever. I don't have to be overly concerned about breira. I can take the one I want, and that's fine. However, again, if it's two types of different food, what do we consider types of different food? He says that the basal tzali umevushal. I have two different types of meat. One is cooked, and one's cooked in the oven, and one's boiled. That is two different types. Different types of poultry. Right, you have a big, all different types of food in front of you on the plate. You have to choose the one that you want, and not the other way around. So let's just see the Ochot Shabbat over here, source 36. This is one of these contemporary Sfarim we keep going back to. He gives a few different practical examples of borer where it comes up. Again, just to summarize what we said until now, and then we'll see the practical applications. So we said ochel mitoch psolet. That is our guideline. That's the rule that we were exploring in the shir. Yeah, if I have food and waste, I have to take the food. What if I have two different types of food, but I only want one of them? We say bottom line is still, I consider that the food I want is ochel, the food I don't want is psolet. Do I say the same thing if really it's all one type of food? Okay, and the piece that I want now is considered ochel, and the piece that I don't want is called psolet. So according to the Taz, yes, we extend it even there. However, the Raman, Mishnah Berurah, and others say no, if it's all the same type of food, then I don't have to be concerned. What is considered different types of food? It can be that it's the same thing, or they don't have to be separate brachas. It can be that there's two types of meat, okay, but they're cooked differently, or the two different parts of chicken, but different parts, and the one that I want versus the one that I don't want, then that could be considered two different foods. And again, I just have to, all the time, so long as I'm selecting what I want right now, and I'm going to eat it, and I'm doing it with my hand, or with my fork or spoon, hopefully, right? That's okay. That's okay, that's considered derech achila and not derech bera. So let's see the Ochot Shabbat, some of the examples. He says, I have large pieces and I have small pieces, they're all the same food. Okay, that's not considered sorting at all. That I can take what I want, so I can set aside, that's fine. Since all the pieces are of the same type, and it's the same use, that's not called a mixture, and therefore there is no borer. Omnam, second paragraph, he says, but if, again, now this doesn't necessarily just relate to food. This can relate to anytime you have a mixture of different items. It says even if they're the same item, but they have different uses, okay? I have large socks and small socks, I guess, with different people. Or sikot rosh gdolot v'ktanot, have different types of hair clips. Some are large and some are smaller. That is considered a tarovet, and there I would have to follow the criteria of borer. Ayulafanav lemad gimel. Yeah.
Drawer full size.
Yes.
Can't say pick out one and you say, I don't want that one. That's not one either. You shouldn't do that.
Okay, so this is the reason why you should fold up your socks before Shabbos, right? You should have it. So again, even no, so I think we'll see.
This is the case I mentioned to you last week. The guy who wouldn't take his coat, I'm sure, because there are about 30 identical black raincoats. He'd want to take one to see if it's his or not.
Yeah.
In case he was missing borrower.
So again, look. What I could say is this: if I don't know what it is, right? I'm taking it out. I'm taking me out of the coat or the sock or whatever it is. I'm taking it right now because I want it, because I think I want the specific coat, right? I take it, and then I see that it's not, so then I put it back. So seemingly that would be you're removing what you want when you see it. You see you don't want it, and you put it. It would seemingly again with the case of the coat racks, it's not clear if that's really considered it's a mixture. Different coats on different hangers. There is another thing which we'll see, I think, in next week's share, But where I'm removing a layer is not considered right. Let's say I have in my drawer, I have all the socks. I know which sock I want. It's on the bottom. It happens to be on the bottom of the pile. It's always the one on the bottom of the pile, right? But that's the one that I want, and there are other things that are on top of it. So in order to get to it, I need to move those away. That would be acceptable as well. That's not considered. That's not considered sorting. Okay. So Yalam Gimel, he says, off shonim. I have different types of different pieces of chicken. Right, thighs and legs and whatever. So there are those who say it's all the same thing. It's all chicken, right? It's all and you could do whatever. And there are those who say no. Certainly, if I only eat wings, or I only like a certain part, then that would be a question. If I have chicken and liver and meat, those are all different types. Lamed Daled. כתבו פוסקים שאף בתערובת של מין אחד, אם הוא מקפיד תמיד שלא לאכול אחד מהם. That's what we said. If I have a mixture of food, it's all the same type of food. Okay, like this example we just saw, different pieces of chicken, but a person only eats a certain type. Okay, so this could be a case whereby for one person it's considered a mixture, for another person it's not. Okay, Lamed Hay, at the bottom, I have sour apples and sweet apples. Okay, here there is a question. We're in doubt whether this is one type or whether they're considered two types. Okay, in the footnote there is discussion if you have red apples and green apples. Okay, again, if one is particular only to eat one type and not eat the other type, then that would be considered a mixture. Over the page, Lamed Vav. Interesting question here. Okay, and this would seemingly here is talking still about Shabbat, because on Yom Tov these rules are going to be a lot more lenient. But he says matzot shleimot u'shvelot. I have whole matzot and I have broken matzot. I want the whole matzot for the sake of lechem mishnah. So there we have a difference of opinion as to whether that's considered a mixture or not. Again, because there is a certain reason, there's a certain purpose that you have for the whole matzot, whereas the other side would say these are matzahs and those are matzahs, they're the same matzah. Okay. And finally, this is a very, very important one, especially if you have kids who are makpid only on one part and not the other. You'll see in a moment. Beitzah muvashelet. I have a hard-boiled egg. That is considered nechshevet kula kamin echad ve'ein omrim shachabon v'achamon nechshavim shnei minim. A lot of parents are breathing a sigh of relief right now. Okay, you have a hard-boiled egg. That is considered one type. It's an egg. It's an egg. Okay, there's different parts. Just like if I had a piece of chicken or whatever, I'm going to cut it up. But the egg is an egg. So one kid only likes the yolk of the egg. One kid won't eat the yolk of the egg. Okay, you can separate that, and that is not considered beira. One more source over here of Karelitz. In source number 37, he says, what if you have two loaves of bread, for example? So he says, you have two loaves of bread, but I prefer one over the other. He says, if there is a chisaron, there is a blemish, so one's gotten a bit moldy, or it's gotten burnt, or something, an objective blemish in it, then they'd be considered two types. One's just a little bit nicer than the other. No, then the prohibition of borer would not apply over there. Okay, so those are some of the examples. Again, as I said, in all of these cases, we've learned the leniency that if I'm taking the piece which I want, and I'm taking it with my hand, and I'm taking it for immediate use, then it's always going to be mutar. The question is, am I allowed to take the piece that I don't want to set it aside? Okay, and that's it. That's what we've been dealing with. If one is food and one is waste, then certainly you have to take the food. If it's two different types of food, objectively, so we saw that even according to the Rambam, we might be able to say that you can set aside the piece you don't want, but most of the poskim say no, I have to set aside the piece I do want. And then we discuss what is considered two different types. Right, it means it's two different types. If it's the same type of food, we generally accept that there is no isur of borer of it.
So in the last case of the towels, your wife has towels set out, and you open up the first towel, and you see it has some mold or pieces missing or whatever.
I'll tell you why.
What do you do with it? You can't set it aside. We do. I mean,
Are you're talking about Lechem Mishnah or?
yeah, for like commission, for Kiddush, you have cuts of cows.
Yeah.
And you open the first one and it's not good, it's molded, you're putting it aside, that's wrong.
So again, why if I took it because I thought I wanted it,
Yeah,
okay, so then but yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I took the piece I wanted. I now open it, I now discover that I actually need to set it aside. Okay, now it's already done. There is, by the way, it's a fascinating question. You can see over here, we don't have time to go into it, but on page 307, there's an essay here, eating food which has been sorted on Shabbat. In other words, if somebody was to do, we have a principle, and we will discuss this in the future, I promise, but we have a principle of Maaseh Shabbat, which means if somebody's performed a forbidden melacha, somebody cooked on Shabbat, they weren't allowed to. Am I allowed to eat that food? Am I allowed to benefit? Okay, all different permutations. So does Maaseh Shabbat apply to the melacha of Boreh? In other words, there was a mixture here of food. Somebody set aside the psolet and rather than the ochel. Am I now allowed to go? So melacha has been done on that food. Am I now allowed to go and eat it, or is that considered? We don't say that by Boreh. Okay, so that is a very interesting discussion. You can see the essay over here, page 317. And that's it. That concludes our study of volume 18. So we're halfway through the Melacha of Boreh. Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll have the new books. Volume 19 will be here. Again, anybody wants to purchase this or previous volumes, let me know. And everybody should have a great week. Try not to be too late.
So my son-in-law,
When we finish Hilchot Shabbat, we'll see on Bezrat Hashem.
my son-in-law who's Sephardi, who